arbitrarily pulled a number out of a hat and said 30% intermittent on the grid. Let's be conservative, chop it in half, and say 15%. That number is subject to a lot of debate, a lot of internal PUC discussions, some of which I'm privy to, a lot of which are behind closed doors. That number is changing, but I don't know how it will change. The utility has published maps showing where the 15% limit has been reached, where it hasn't been reached. For example, Hana has a 1% penetration. I don't know specifically by neighborhood here.
Does California still have the 15% limit?
A lot of states are looking at that. The problem that we're facing is that if you look in the United States, and let's exclude Alaska for the moment, and exclude Texas, which has their own system. Canada, the United States, and Mexico have 3 massive transmission systems that go north to south. So Quebec and Miami are on the same system. If you add a little bit of solar to that, or you lose a little bit of solar, that can easily be absorbed. When you're talking about, on this island, for example, that South Point is a 20 megawatt wind farm. There's a 200 megawatt system on this island. That's a sizable percentage of the load. Right now, the utility says we will not buy any wind power from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. The problem the PUC is facing is if you say the utility is forced to buy net metered solar from customers, and they reach a point where they can't handle more intermittent power on the grid, then a new solar customer will be displacing the existing wind energy producing South Point and Hobby, which will piss off their owners a lot. And therefore, all of these issues are being discussed at the PUC, where interestingly enough, DBED is more or less on the same page as us. And the consumer advocate is trying to make the utility look really liberal and green. So we're in a lot of discussions, and it's going to be a lot of turmoil. And what the state legislature did in its infinite wisdom this past session is reliability is managed by reliability councils throughout the United States, large multi-state regional councils. Hawaii is the only state where the utility manages reliability issues. The state said, why don't we transfer this function to the PUC to allow the Public Utilities Commission to control reliability. The Public Utilities Commission has no electrical engineers on staff, no transmission engineers on staff. So they're thinking about hiring one person from the mainland to be in charge of it. Yes.
Good evening, everyone. I'd like to make a very, very interesting announcement that I'll take it very short time to explain now. And if you're interested in this, you can hang around here and we can talk further. Because this subject is so fascinating and it goes along with this alternative technologies that we're talking about. I'm an independent researcher, and I found a solution that I like to make basically public, give it to public, give it to all of us, because it is so dangerous to have it alone, and I don't want to have it. And this technology, it is very simple. What it is, solution, it is what is called, what I call counterbalance. For example, when you need 1 kilowatt of energy, all you have to do, find what kind of force you need, that it can counter or neutralize the demand of that energy. It can neutralize the force. So when you neutralize the demand, all you have to do, very small amount of energy is required to keep this machine going. And to make it very simple and short, this source or this force is the gravity. So if you're interested, I would like to make a public domain where we can do something about it, because I don't want to pursue, I don't want to start chasing this energy, because it's not safe at all. And I do like to share it with people interested after this.
My email is henry.lifeoftheland@gmail.com. And I do have an energy list, and I do have energy articles where I can talk more about it. Gravity is interesting because most energy storage on the mainland, right now, if you turn off all the generators in the United States, the grid would stay powered a tenth of a second. That's how much storage we have. Most of the storage on the mainland is pumped storage hydro, which means you have two reservoirs and you use excess wind and solar to pump water from your lower reservoir to your upper reservoir, and then you drop it as hydroelectric power when you need it. On this island, there is a drinking water system in the Kailua Kona area that uses that system between two drinking water reservoirs. So you can do it on fresh water, drinking water. You can have hydroelectric energy coming off the sewer lines, on the wastewater lines. There's a lot of ways of doing it, but it's not tapped into. So pump storage hydro is the major battery source for grid-based electricity systems on the mainland now. Right now, there's a lot of work looking at other things, like lithium batteries, which power our computers. Unfortunately, lithium batteries right now work for short periods of time, but not for the major problem that we have in this state, which is we have our maximum energy demand after the sun has set. The evening is the period of time when you have the least wind. So if you rely on solar and wind and you use the maximum amount of energy when you have neither, you need a storage system. That problem does not exist on the mainland. And it's why we need to come up with a solution that works for us without looking at the mainland model.
Well, if they wanted to use the generated power between 6 p.m. and 10, whenever the HELCO says, okay, we don't want to buy your power from the, was it 6?
10 p.m., 6 a.m.
Sorry. How much water would we need to pump up and store in order to be able to use that energy the next morning?
The problem with that, and it gets slightly technical, but I'll try to keep it as simple as possible. Generators can operate at certain output levels. And at night, the utility generators are all dropped to a minimum level and maintained at a certain level to handle nighttime energy, which is fairly constant demand. There are not a lot of industries or residences that want to have a surge of power at 3 in the morning. So the utility generators are all maintained at a very low level at night, and that's why they can't handle wind, which tends to fluctuate up and down. Their generators are sort of stuck in this low level. And the question is, what is the low level? Can you lower a little bit? Can you absorb a little bit of wind? That is behind confidentiality agreements.
But you don't need water to pump up and then generate the power again. All you have to do, lift up 550 pounds of weight. And when you drop it down, you can generate 1 kilowatt of power. If you can continue doing that and increase 5 or 10 times, then you have all the power you need.
Yes.
I saw a program on TV one time years ago when they had the Learning Channel, showing NGOs in India up against the Himalayas and everything, where they took people that lived, hand to mouth, and they had a stream on their property, and it didn't have to be very much. It was like if you had a 1.5 foot fall of water, it could generate enough to power their homes. And we have an abundance of water here, and I've wanted to do my downspout and create electricity. And it may sound off the wall.
It doesn't sound off the wall at all. You look at the First Hawaiian Bank in downtown Honolulu. They pump water up 400 feet to the upper floor. Somebody flushes the toilet. They drop it 400 feet down, and there's no wheel creating electricity. So hydropower, there are a lot of ways that you can tap hydropower, a lot of ways you can use it as a battery. And that's why creating an entity that will help people find ways of getting off the grid and all the innovative ways of techniques is helpful. I have an equally crazy one. I've often thought the way to encourage people to think about local power is you have a runner with a cap with a tiny little propeller, and they're running at night. They're running, so they're creating wind. It's hitting the propeller, and it's flashing a light on the hood to let cars know they're there. Now, so we need actually really creative, bizarre ideas instead of just saying the utility knows all the answers. Yes.
I just wanted to comment on that a little bit and ask you, in your model, is there distributed energy created by smaller groups of people than the whole state, but larger than single households? Because I'm imagining that having a set of lead acid batteries in every single household of people that drop off, well, that's a lot of lead, you know, that's a lot of acid. And it's a shame that some of these technologies for storage that are emerging couldn't be taken on at the larger scale and the grid continue to be used. I think what I'm hearing though is that the old way is so entrenched that we just as well get off of it and become distributed.
That's a very good point. When Edison first came around, Edison talked about having power plants right where the demand was needed. Westinghouse and Tesla were like, no, we need these massive power plants somewhere out in the boonies and large transmission lines to bring them into where people needed them. Throughout most of the 20th century, the cost of these large generators built out in the rural areas and large transmission lines became cheaper and cheaper and became the way to go. In the last 10 years, what you're talking about, microgrids, having small community-based systems, local lines within a community, and sharing power within the community has become cost effective. So you know you don't need it individual house by house. You could do it community by community. You could have a community association get together and say, we're going to create power within our community. In Alaska, there are electric co-ops that have 200 members, 100 members, small co-ops that are part of a national organization of co-ops, and they can tap into federal money to create these microgrids where the local community controls their own future.
Well, would the microgrid have batteries at some central place? Or?
One of the simple ways is to have water, where you're pumping water between two sites. You can either pump it up and drop it. You can have lead batteries, you can have lithium batteries, you can have a variety of sources.
Some interesting flywheel stuff.
Flywheels are where you create a little energy and you create something that spins very, very fast, tens of thousands of revolutions per second. And then when you have a loss of energy on the grid, you can capture the kinetic energy of the wheel. So there are many solutions. And what you really need is people either individually or small communities to come together, and some county or statewide entity that can provide the financing and can connect you to the different independent solar companies, independent wind companies, banks and everything, and act as a conduit to allow individuals and communities to leave the grid.
Henry?
Yes.
Hi, Henry. There's a big lie floating around the Big Island by a geothermal promoter. His name is Richard Ha. He's a tomato grower. He was a banana farmer here in Puna. And his big lie is that Iceland is a great example of what you can follow for geothermal development. And he visited. He was taken, I given a free trip to Iceland to take a look at it. And he came back and said all these glowing words about how Iceland was the model that Puna and the Big Island should have for large amounts of geothermal. And he was spouting 1,000 megawatts, 1,500 megawatts when he was head of the Geothermal Advisory Commission that I was on. And we looked at the data that he had brought back. Jay Ignacio, the head of HELCO, was sitting next to me, and he said, well, Richard, show us all these figures that you brought back on your trip. And he looked at it and he said, Richard, do you realize that 75% of the energy generated in Iceland is hydroelectric? So I'd like the folks to know here at this meeting that the geothermal, yes, there's 400 megawatts, almost 500 megawatts of electricity electricity being generated in Iceland on a daily basis from geothermal, but there's 1,500 megawatts of hydroelectric. And what the geothermal is being used for is the aluminum smelting industry, which is creating a toxic situation for the residents. And the residents are now fighting the continued use of geothermal for smelting.
And
So,
you raised one good point, because the
Thank you.
majority of geothermal in the world right now is used for industrial processes, and is not used to generate electricity. If 1,000 megawatts were put in Puna to generate electricity, it would represent over 10% of the geothermal to electricity produced in the entire world. Over 10%.
Why is that they use it specifically for industry, because of all of the
Because if you have heat at a specific a place, and you put an industrial plant on top, you can tap the heat and use the heat to handle certain industrial processes. And if you have a temporary drop in the heat, you can wait until you get more heat. Converting it to electricity is not something that's regularly done for electricity.
Yeah,
So thank you, Mel.
sure.
I'm real concerned about the attraction this geothermal is taking away from other solutions. And I don't mean to belittle those comments, but with the amount of rain we get on the side of the island, and we do a lot of rainwater catchment anyway, and the gravity thing, isn't there a way to catch it high and let it fall individually on our land?
There are a lot of ways like that, and the utility told us a few years ago. We met with the advertiser in the Star Bulletin, and we met with Hawaiian Electric. And the advertiser in Star Bulletin told us they might not be around in the near future, and of course one went under. And Hawaiian Electric said to us, we may not be around in the future either. A high-level executive at Hawaiian Electric said, we may not be here. And that's why they told the Securities and Exchange Commission, we may not be here. Now, the utility wanted to show that they were renewable, and this is an example. On their Ward Avenue facility, opposite the Neil Blaisdell Center on Oahu, they used to control the entire Oahu grid on the back side of the wall facing the street, until they realized that if a car hit the wall, the entire grid would go down. So they moved it elsewhere. But they decided, what if we put solar on the roof of the Ward Avenue facility? It's our building, it's our roof. What if we put solar there to see how it could be done? And so they spent a couple of years thinking about that, and they brought in HECO. You may remember HECO is this company that we got 221 tax funds for. We sunk millions of dollars in to prop them up, and then they split and moved to Idaho. So HECO and HECO teamed up to put solar on the roof of the HECO building. And it took them 4 years to decide they couldn't figure out how to finance it. And therefore they're not doing it. And the reason is, and the utility has said this to us, they don't know how to make money from the sun. Therefore, they do not want to look at alternatives.
My question wasn't anything to do with solar, it was about rainwater catchment.
Rainwater, hydro, wind, solar, anything that's distributed, anything that's community-based, the utility does not know how to make money from it. And therefore, they do not want to do it.
I'm having a real hard time
Okay,
getting my
sorry.
voice heard the right way, and it's not your fault, it's you to do it right. If I'm on my land and I catch my rain up, is it conceivable I can make power by letting it fall on my land
Yes,
down
yes,
without asking anybody's permission?
yes.
Well,
As
then how
long-
hard is that?
It's not hard.
And why don't we do that?
Because right now, if you picture, there's no company out there that would make money from doing that.
But why can't we figure that?
You can figure that out. It is done by some people. There are places that have that, but it would be helpful if we have an entity that would help go out into the community and encourage people and show them how it's done.
They do
You need
have-
a much larger volume of water than you probably ever get off your roof. You need like a running stream that runs a foot wide, 2 feet deep before you generate 40 watts enough to run a house.
Well, there are homes in Hilo up in the, Terrace Drive area where there are streams going through there, and there is one man with hydroelectric right on the stream going through.
There's a
his
number of
yard.
them.
Yeah.
And
Richard
if
Hall.
you use it, Richard Hall, right, is looking at putting in streams. If you look at it not as your only solution, but as a component of the fact that you can have solar, the fact that you can have wind. For example, Governor Boki, governor of Oahu, 1824, went with Kamehameha II to England, and he saw a windmill. And he said, wow, nobody had ever seen it here. By 1836, we had windmills operating on Oahu, on Alakea Street, right in the middle of what's now the street. Electricity didn't arrive for 50 years. So we had both hydro and wind before we had electricity here. It's a matter of tapping into what the native Hawaiians already had before Hawaiian Electric came here. And we now have the cost-effective methods and the techniques to do that, and we need to encourage people to do that, but we can't go to the utility, because the utility is aimed at how to make money for their shareholders. Right now, Connie Lau makes $6 million a year. If Kua Koa is successful, she has a $23 million golden parachute. She doesn't know how to make money from hydro on your property and doesn't want to encourage you to do it.
Anyway, I got a comment.
Let me ask a couple of people who haven't asked questions, and then we'll come back. Who hasn't? Yes. No.
Yeah, I
anybody
wanted to
who-
ask you about
Okay.
if someone here, like some of us operate woodworking shops or sawmills or something, and we need to run large motors and equipment, you know, in the middle of the day. What do you recommend for someone who wants to be off the grid, but you need to run like 6 different electric motors and have 440 volts to run these things?
Solar is ideal during the day, and having excess solar, when you don't need the motors, you can find ways of storing it to transfer it to the evening. So I think solar, if you need power during the day, solar is the most effective.
But the amount I'd have to spend to get enough solar to run the motors is outrageous. It's like
You need a backup.
$100,000 outlay for solar panels. I mean, I want to do this, but I don't know how to do it.
I would imagine there are ways through the federal government supporting small businesses, which I take it you are a small business. You're not talking about a residence. There are small businesses, different kinds of tax credits.
There are grants called rural electrification grants that
Right.
regularly come out at least twice a year.
The U.S. Department of Agriculture was the one who half financed Kua Island Utility Co-op using what's called the Rural Utility Service. USDA funds renewable energy projects in non-cities.
And they're specifically set up for small businesses, like farms and small businesses.
You might be surprised too. I mean, I run saws at my house all the time. I'm off grid. I don't have any issue with it. But I think that the price of all this stuff is coming down. The practicality is getting better. In terms of what you said earlier, I'm interrupting. We were talking about off grid and on grid. Really, the utility is just going to end up playing a shell game. Every customer that they lose, all they have to do is raise the meter rate. So in Florida, they were petitioning for a $45 meter rate. You can buy a bank of 8 batteries for about $30 under the warranty period per month. So it's not that far out of reach. We're already paying $25 a month to have it metered if you shut the main off. So if you're paying $30 for the batteries, you're paying either way. You're either going to pay the utility, you're going to buy your own battery bank.
And one example, Better Place was thinking about bringing in electric cars where they would own the battery and you would pull into a gas station, they replace one battery with another battery. So it may be that you can create an entity like part of a public utility that's regulated by the PUC that would maintain batteries so that when people's batteries go down or when they need financing, you can work out arrangements. Part of it is coming up with new methods of delivering power to people where they need it and getting away from the central station utility. And there are many possibilities. We're on the edge of a cusp because right now Hawaii has greatest amount of resources available anywhere in the U.S. for on-site generation. The greatest amount and the highest utility costs. High costs, greatest resources, and the utility is about to send your rates through the ceiling. So this is the ideal place to test the alternatives. Right now, major companies are pouring money into Hawaiian Electric to be part of their grid studies. But if we create an alternative model, we can get others to put money into looking at different solutions, on-grid solutions. And Hawaiian Electric may wake up one day and do the same thing IBM did. IBM lost half the world market in computers in a decade, and then went, oh, personal computers, of course, we always loved them. AT&T wasn't crazy about cell phones, and then they caught on so much, and now AT&T executives have cell phones. We have smartphones. What's the difference between a smartphone and a smart grid? Smart grid has a grid. Smartphones have no grid. So we need to move the utility to actually a smart energy future beyond the grid. Yes.
There's a company in Florida that's secretly building portable power plants for government, and here's how it works. I spent a lot of time to look into this. They have a 1,000 gallon of tank that holds 1,000 gallon of water. 1,000 gallon of water is 8,000 pounds. So the tank has a cone-shaped bottom. It doesn't work if it is not cone. It has to be cone-shaped. They drain the tank, and the 8,000 pound of water goes into a vortex. It takes 4 kilowatts to pump the water back into the tank. But when 8,000 gallons of water, 8,000 pounds of water, which is 1,000 gallons, goes into the vortex, they are able to generate 26 kilowatt of power.
This is a form of pump storage hydro, and
Right.
There is a lot of this research going on, and we're at the cutting edge of a lot of commercialization of these alternative storage systems. Now, picture Hawaiian Electric. Picture yourselves on the board of Hawaiian Electric, okay? You're an executive, you're as a board member, a non-employee of the company, you are paid to serve on the board. You're paid to serve on committees of the board. You're paid to chair committees on the board. And you see all these alternative storage mechanisms about to make a major splash. What do? You commit ratepayers to paying billions of dollars to maintaining a system that was designed in the 1800s. Because if you can put enough money, enough capital into that, and get the Public Utilities Commission to approve it, then your customers will be stuck paying your bills forever while everybody else is adopting these storage systems. HECO knows that they're on the cutting edge, that we have a higher renewable energy penetration on Maui and the Big Island and on Lanai than anywhere else in the United States. And they fear the future. And therefore they do not want you to look at those alternatives. Yes.
I'm having some lights come on here. So if I'm getting this right, they actually are going to want people to grid tie, rather
Yes.
than get completely away from them. Because if we grid tie, they got us that way.
Right. An example of this.
We have no control over what the connection fee is going to be in 10 years.
An example of this is there was a senator from Maui who used to serve on the Maui Council Environmental Committee and then went to the state Senate and chaired the Energy Committee. And he got up on the floor of the Senate at the closings of this session and said, the reason we need a cable between Oahu and Maui is that Maui has excess wind energy, and Oahu has excess base load energy. Maui has a shortage of base load energy that's 24/7. And therefore, we need the cable to bring base load power from Oahu to Maui. Now, when you
What about land
consider,
laws?
when you consider that,
What about land laws?
well, here's the catch though. Maui's all-time greatest energy use ever was about 204 megawatts. Their base load is currently 267. They currently have 60 megawatts excess. And so what is HECO doing? They're asking for 50 more. So they'll have 110 excess. They'll have 50% extra. And yet the Maui senator is saying, I'm too tied to the utility to acknowledge a simple fact. We need this billion-dollar cable to bring Oahu power in. So legislators, and I'm ruling out Faye and some other great legislators. Legislators get money from the utility, and it's all hidden. I mean, years ago, we stood outside of a legislator who was having a fundraiser, and 80 people from HECO showed up. And you looked at the financial records, and not $1 showed up in the financial contributions, because they must have handed in a rubber band set of checks, and each one must have been $1 less than the reporting figure. So the utility pumps in a lot of resources into politicians to make sure that we keep the system we have. And they want a grid connected, they want a cable linking the islands, they want smart grids, they want computers, they want to really jack up your rates. In fact, the legislature passed a bill a few years ago that said, you know, people complained when the first wind farms came to Maui that they were tied to the price of oil, and therefore the wind farms came in, people thought the rates would drop, and the rates actually did not drop, and people were concerned. Well, the legislature passed a bill a couple of years ago saying, what if renewables cost more than oil? So what? You can do it, PUC. In fact, Aina Koa Pono, down in Pahoa, was proposing a biofuel company that was proposing to sell biofuel to the Keahole plant, HELCO's plant. And it would require a subsidy of Oahu ratepayers of $250 million over 20 years. $250 million. The consumer advocate said, what's the problem? We mounted enough pressure that the PUC did not adopt our figure of $250 million, but did footnote reference life of land. And they said it would have been required a subsidy in the 9-digit range. So the PUC acknowledged it would be a $100 million subsidy from Oahu. HELCO also wanted a subsidy from you guys, above the rate of what they're currently paying for fuel. So Aina Koa Pono was going to be the single most expensive energy source the state had ever seen. And the reason HECO put it out was because the people doing it were politically connected to the governor and to Hawaiian Electric. And when the PUC, under mounting public pressure, denied the contract, the governor called up the PUC commissioners and said, what are you doing? Why didn't you approve this? So the administration, the legislature and the administration are tied to the system we have. We are in a transition role right now, and they fear that. It is up to us to push them to step where they'll then hop on the train that's coming down the track and say, we were always on board. What's your issue? Yes.
Henry, at your Hilo meeting, you raised some real good issues. In fact, maybe run home and draw up this analysis sheet, which I gave you earlier. And my concern is that a lot of times I hear the candidates, I haven't heard you, Russell, but I've heard the candidates shooting off these things, like you mentioned about that Maui legislature. Whether they have the knowledge or lack of knowledge or whatever it is. I think you would rather call them comments, they don't have a clue. The legislators, of course, would say, and Russell would mention, but they don't have a clue what's really going on here as far as the energy situation. They don't want to know. And when you brought up all these issues, and let's just look at solar, and you brought up the fact that the collectors are made in China. The batteries are a toxic industry. And so I'm saying, where's this analysis fit in to the entire picture of all the generation mechanisms that we have? And is there a place to get this answer of a spreadsheet analysis of each of the generation and that we're looking at? And the second question is, as you were talking geothermal, mostly going to Hawaii. But in your paper online there, you talked about 100% geothermal on this island. And I'd like to, again, I wonder, how does that fit into the analysis and what we're looking at there?
Okay, that's actually three, and I want to raise the first one. The first one is the quote on the Maui senator. The Maui's, what I generally do is the legislature has a lot of audio files, the House better than the Senate. But I try to get the audio files downloaded on my computer before I quote somebody. Because I want to heavily document my stuff. I don't want to make statements and say I can't back up where they come from. The second question dealt with the nature of the impacts of renewables. And this is really important because if I want to define renewable energy, I could do it in less than 20 words. I would say a fuel, not coal, oil, natural gas, or nuclear, that has low climate, environmental, social, and financial impacts. Now, the state legislature defines renewable energy using over 200 words. And they do not mention impacts, environmental, cultural, social, or cost. So, for example, if you take coal and you burn it at a garbage to energy plant, that is renewable. If you burn it at a utility plant, it's fossil fuel. If you take coal and convert it to ethanol or biodiesel, no matter where you burn it, that's renewable. If you take coal and convert it to hydrogen, you burn it at a garbage to energy plant, it's renewable. You burn it at a utility plant, it's a fossil fuel. You go to the Amazon and you chop down the entire forest. You pave most of it and you grow soybeans on the rest. And you take the soybeans and convert them to biodiesel and burn them on this island to provide power. That is renewable energy. So the state definition, as you can probably guess, was written by the utility. So when the utility says, we want renewable energy, they actually want how they define it to be. And the impact analysis is not being done by the utility, it's not being done by the state. So when we look at alternatives, and I'll take wind as an example, the wind requires magnets to provide the power, to provide the magnetic power that's spinning to create the electricity. The majority of wind turbines in the world are made in China. China uses a very toxic material to produce the magnets. They dig up huge amounts of earth, they sift it with acids, they pull out trace minerals, they leave acid pools and lakes on their ground, and they ship it to us to use in wind farms while they're building a new coal plant every week. Obviously, that's not sustainable. And if you look at this trace mineral that's used in wind and you say, what is the second leading country that's producing it, that has it? It's Afghanistan, which explains why we're there. But there are ways of making wind that uses less toxic materials. Solar, you can use arsenic for it, but you can also take steel, have a parabolic steel that catches the sun, focuses it on a pipe filled with molten salt, and use the thermal heat to generate electricity that does not involve toxic material. That is being tested right now in Keahole by Sopogy, a local company that wanted to do more work here and found that they had to go leave to Hawaii to do the research because locally there wasn't enough interest in what they were doing. There are ways of looking at the toxic emissions of each type of system, and we fully favor it. The utility does not, and the state doesn't, because they're not interested in minimizing pollution.
Is that analysis available anywhere, or do we have to create it?
I think a lot of it we have to create.
Okay.
Some of it exists. It is.
No one place.
There's no one place right now.
Well, that's why I think, because when I sat at the mayor's talk the other night, and I hear these things being spurted out. Like we need to do the waste energy, and once more we got capacity, and what is the impact of that? And we need to be able to stand up and say with an analysis sheet, with a spreadsheet, hey guys, the facts are right here, and you're off base on it.
And the waste
In a nice way, with a law.
And the waste to energy, you have to look at the big picture, which is that a waste to energy plant produces air emissions such as dioxins. But if you landfill the stuff, you release gases which are far more climate affecting than CO2. So there's a trade-off. And of course, the number one way is not to use so much packaging. The number two is to recycle the packaging you have. The third is to reduce your waste stream. But if you're going to waste it, you have to look at the total emissions on the garbage to energy versus the landfilling. And the government has not done enough analysis on it.
So are you saying the landfill releases first the gas?
It releases methane, which is 20 times worse a greenhouse gas impact than CO2.
The thing is that methane can't, I've seen these done on landfills, I've actually looked at them happening. They can capture the methane, and they can use portable generators. In fact, waste management is a big one on this. Here we've got it right on our own island. I'm not promoting waste management. But they capture the methane, and they actually generate with these.
It can be used
Diesel.
like at propane.
Yeah.
Now, it does, and what you have to look into that is, one, whether you're doing it on a new landfill or an existing landfill. For example, on Oahu, we have a small landfill in Kailua where methane is being captured. We have a large landfill in Waimanalo where the amount of methane released is insufficient to generate any kind of reasonable profit. In fact, it would be a money loss.
Didn't they try that in Waimanalo?
Yeah. The other issue is that methane captured has leakages, and it's the amount of methane that escapes the process that matters because it's so much more potent than CO2. And the analysis is really not being done but by the government or the utility.
Right.
I had a third question about 100% geothermal.
I, when I wrote my report, assumed that not all communities would immediately go for full community empowerment. So I gave as one option that Hawaii Island would use more geothermal, but using geothermal, say, from Hualalai rather than from Puna. Because if Denny Kaufman is suggesting that he wants more geothermal, and the people on the west side of the island are saying more geothermal, why don't they tap their own mountain instead of Puna? And there are resources on different places around the Big Island. None proven, but the reason it's not proven is because the number one researcher in the state is Don Thomas, and he's under contract to Ormat. And if you remember, I don't know if any of you were adults in 1924 and remember the Teapot Dome scandal. The Teapot Dome scandal is where the U.S. had a petroleum reserve. And they were storing petroleum, and a private company came in on the side of the government reserve, used a horizontal directional drill, tapped down to the reservoir, and stole the oil. Now,
They didn't know, did they?
They knew exactly what they were doing. And since 1924, oil has played a major role in every presidential election in the United States. So Ormat is concerned that if they publicly identify where they found a geothermal hotspot, that some yoko will come in from the side and say, "You spent all the money finding it, now I'm going to pull it out of the ground." So Ormat is trying to be very secretive about that. And if you've looked at the papers, Mililani Trask and Ormat have both suggested Waimanalo as a site for geothermal. Ormat is looking at Lualualei on Oahu. Ormat is looking at Ulupalakua Ranch. And you might say, where are they getting the money to actually do this research? Actually, they're using federal stimulus funds that we paid for to do private research to figure out how they can increase their profit.
Well, why is GM in such good shape?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Why, if you look at the American Wind Energy Association, a 29-member board promoting wind across the country, and only 7 wind companies are on the 29-member board, but BP, giant coal companies, giant nuclear companies are on it because they're interested in tapping into federal dollars rather than actually moving off fossil fuels. Because we offer great subsidies for wind.
Ormat's well was found by the state. That was scientific observation hole program, which Don Thomas ran. And so we paid for all of the exploration. They actually drilled holes all over the place. They found the one that they ran HGPA on. That's the one that Ormat's using now. So we actually paid for that one too. And also, you know, I talked to Mike Kuatini at Ormat, and he said that Puna only uses 6 megawatts. It's 4%. And I don't know if that's right or not, but that's what he told me.
No, it's about 30 megawatts. They just had a 6 megawatt. They just had a 6 megawatt expansion.
No, I'm talking about what we use in the district as consumers. Now, he told me, Mike, you know, and I guess he knows, but I don't know, but he told me that 6 megawatts, which is 4% of the power on this island, and we already produce over 20% there at PGV.
I should talk measurements for a moment. Megawatts is the capacity. If you have a 3-car garage and you only own 1 car, your capacity, you could have 3 cars. So megawatts is a measure of the capacity of the plant. Megawatt hours is the measurement of the exact amount of electricity used. You could go to Hawaii Electric Industries, HEI, and look at their SEC filings, Securities and Exchange Commission filings, and they will list how many megawatt hours they buy and how much they use on each island. I do not know off the top of my head what percentage of PG&E powers the grid.
Talking about us
Well,
residents.
what he told me was they put in a substation outside of the power plant, and they put another one in Aina Koa, because they used to send the power to HELCO. And so I was asking about line loss and all that kind of stuff, and he says, no, we don't do that anymore. We now have a substation right outside of the power plant in Pohiki, and we have another one in Aina Koa. And I said, well, how much power does Puna use? And he said 6 megawatts. And I don't know how, you know, if it's a different description, but that's what he told me. I want to ask him again. That's kind of why I'm asking. I want to talk about that with him again.
Yeah, and also what region he means by Puna. For example, volcano is part of Puna.
Right, I know.
So, yeah, check that out. I heard the number that the Puna geothermal plant provides enough megawatt hours to power the Puna sub-region down here. But that was off the cuff by somebody who made the comment, and I haven't personally checked.
Last month they said that of the total generation, on this island, 20% of it was geothermal.
It varies a lot by month. Again, I would have to check. I don't know.
It's what HELCO put out. They also put out.
HELCO says all sorts of things. I always like to check.
Right, yeah, I would agree with that. But they also put out, I wonder, they put out that the solar is 0.006%. So are they just using that plant over there in Keahole, or are they including all the people that are generating solar and putting it onto the grid? But that's, I mean, 0.006 is quite a small amount.
I didn't look at the breakdown of individual solar systems on this island. I do know that major renewable energy sources, the way the state defines renewable energy, the major renewable energy here are the wind farms and the geothermal.
Did you have
And
a
I
date
think
on that?
I think the third is the hydroelectric.
The hydro is 4%, wind is 13%, geothermal 20, and fossil fuel 63. And I think, because they say oil, they don't say fossil fuel. I think they must be including the naphtha in with the oil, so that's
Yeah,
63%.
naphtha, fuel oil, and diesel.
Yeah. And then solar, 0.006.
It doesn't sound like a lot, but the problem is that the wind farms went in before solar became very cost effective. And the wind farms have enormous fluctuation. The problem right now is if a wind farm is going full blast one moment and drops off rapidly another moment, you have to have a bunch of fossil fuel generators that can be like idling like teenagers revving at a light, ready to take off when the wind drops. So you have to have all these power plants that are waiting to offset the wind. And as you add more solar, you're interfering with how much the wind farms can sell their wind energy. It's a bit complex. I'd be happy to have an offline dialogue with
Yeah,
you.
good, thank you.
Yes.
I got kind of two questions. One of the geothermal companies, Moku Power, is touting that they're able to use geothermal to create hydrogen for energy, to be able to store energy. Is there ways to be able to create hydrogen here without also tapping into geothermal? And is that a viable way for, for storing energy? And two, certain small group of people are talking about refinancing, buying out HELCO and PDG. Would that bankrupt us?
Okay, your first question is how do you create hydrogen? And the two ways is electrolysis of water or geothermal. Geothermal could also produce ammonia, NH3, as an alternative fuel source. There are those issues. They involve also cost. You mentioned Moku Power, which is a guy in the mainland has figured out a way to basically drill a wider hole than what Geothermal Ventures does. You pop down a mechanical device into the hole, and you capture the Earth's energy, heat, in the hole, and you create the process to convert it to electricity in the hole. You basically have an extension cord bringing it out. When Moku Power came out with their proposal, I figured out fairly easily, fairly quickly, that I knew more about their system than they did. I would be reluctant to invest to support a new technology where you put all the technology down the hole, because if something goes wrong, you could have a real problem. Basically their method is to take the heat of the Earth, to heat up the gas inside their system, and to use the gas to create electricity. It's a complex system, heavily copyrighted, heavily hidden behind non-disclosure agreements at the federal level.
And drilling 6,000.
Drilling 6,000 feet. It's not a prime time ready to go right now process. Your third question dealt with Kua Koa. Kua Koa proposed to buy out the utility. They proposed it at a time when they were probably way before prime time ready to propose it, but they jumped out with the idea figuring that HECO might sell out to them quickly. At the time that they incorporated, they had very few Hawaii people on their board. Nobody who had ever run a utility, nobody who had ever run a large company. And they had no idea how they would change the company, except have massive geothermal here and cable it to Oahu. And they didn't understand the technology involved. They have since brought on more sophisticated people onto their board. But they still have, as I pointed out to Ro Marth and other leaders on Kua Koa, that they have only one woman on their board. I said, surely the entire state could find a second woman. And their response was, if you can find one, let us know. So they have that problem. They still have the problem that nobody on their board has ever run a utility. They have the problem that a lot of their people look like the people who would jump in, make it, if they could, turn around a quick profit and then split. I'm not saying Richard Ha. Richard Ha, I think, cares about Hawaii in his own way. I'm not talking about some of the other local people here, but the one question I asked them, and I've had several long meetings. I've been up to Richard Ha's place. I've been to Roll Mark's condo on Oahu. I've been to Ted Peck's place. He's a former energy director of DBED who was part of Kua Koa. I've asked them, what would you go inside the HECO staff? If I were to take over the utility, if I were to buy them out tomorrow, what would be my number one concern? My number one concern would be, and something you could never recover from, is what happens if the day you buy out the company, the grid goes down statewide? And the grid can go down two ways. It can go down simply where you can turn on the switch and after 2 or 3 days get the system back up. But you can also fry the equipment. You could damage the equipment in certain ways of shutting down the utility. And while most of the people at the utility are honest people, I have seen certain examples where independent power producers have tried to hook up and found their equipment damaged, sabotaged. So what happens if you take over the utility and somehow the grid is damaged and destroyed? How do you safeguard against that? Obviously, you need people in place who can manage the grid. You need to get them there day one so you can secure the grid. And I asked Kua Koa, who are you looking at to secure the grid? I know who I would pick. They said, we have not looked at the internal structure of the utility. We're only talking about buying them out.
Oh my God.
Now, the people I would pick are people within the utility who I know can manage the grid and who I trust. They're not necessarily the people managing the grid now, but I know people who understand the grid and could be trusted with the grid. And I think you need to know that before you contemplate buying out the utility. Yes.
This is a bit to the side of this.
Good.
About a year and a half or 2 years ago, the cable between the not OTEC, the Time Warner cable between here and Maui or Oahu, whatever, got severed. We've never had an explanation for it whatsoever, nothing. And at that time, RIMPAC was going on. And I thought, in my own cynical way, that it was probably one of their submarines that did it, but we never got an explanation. And your life of the land, you know what did that. And wouldn't any kind of grid and cable be vulnerable to the same types of damages?
I don't know that specific cable, but I know the two leading causes of cable destruction on the number one cause is ships, particularly anchors, snagging cables. That's the number one reason that telecommunication cables break underwater. The number two is landslides, especially in steep slope areas. For example, off Keahole Power Plant, there's a steep slope where telecommunication cables come on board, and there has been movement along that steep slope that has dislodged cables. Across the country and the world, those are the two leading causes of telecommunication cable problems. What has been suggested for the proposed cable from Oahu to Lanai and Molokai is, if something happens to the underwater cable, they would need 18 months to repair it.
I'm sure you're aware of the HBO study that was released about a couple months ago that said that the probability of a volcano, they didn't even talk about earthquakes, the probability of a volcano destroying a geothermal plant or the cable pad, on the island of Hawaii was 60% in 50 years, 60 to 90% in 50 years. which means that if you're relying on geothermal power as a baseload power somewhere else, it seems like a fairly boneheaded argument, because you have to keep the reserve somewhere else in case it's destroyed, as it most probably will be.
The utility plans to shut down very few of their generators. So it would be installing all this new generation, installing all new transmission lines, and not taking down too many of their existing generators. We have talked to them, and about the only 2 power plants they actually have on the books as shutting down are the Hill and the Puna HELCO plants. But I don't even know if they're talking about removing them rather than just turning them off. But that's about the extent of the conversation. So we're talking about adding a whole bunch of new generators, both renewables and fossil fuels, and not keeping the existing systems in place. So that, right, if there's a lava flow, you can turn back on everything that you have. So, like for example, next to Aloha Tower on Oahu, the Honolulu power plant, the 2 generators both predate statehood.
You're talking about the political climate in the state legislature and the ties to utilities. What kind of reforms do you think are possible? Or what would you push if you could close the bill forward?
The number 1 reform I would push is HRS, Hawaii Revised Statute 84-17, talks about financial disclosure statements. Right now, the legislators are required to file annual financial disclosure statements, and they're publicly available. The cabinet is also publicly available. But if you look at the commissioners on the Water Board, the Land Use Commission, the Board of Land and Natural Resources, the Public Lands Development Corporation, the Aloha Tower Development Corporation, the Hawaii Community Development Association, and the Public Utilities Commission. The commissioners on those make very, very powerful decisions every year. They are required under state law to file annual financial disclosure statements. State law makes it a crime for you to see those documents. So I would simply say they're already available, they're key decision makers. Simply take what's already filed and make it public. That would be a major disclosure, because right now, for example, if you look at the 3 PUC commissioners, they are making key decisions, and we do not know what conflicts they have. I can personally tell you that one of the key PUC commissioners has been to private petroleum meetings on the mainland, junkets on the mainland. But that kind of information is not public, for the large part. So disclosure is key. The second thing that's absolutely key is disclosing the price of the contracts. For example, if you ask, how much does geothermal cost us? Well, geothermal has a price for on-peak demand and off-peak. Daytime energy and nighttime energy are sold at different rates. They're sold at different rates for 3 different levels of output, which makes it totally hard to figure out how much. And yet, that is a lot better than biofuel companies, where all the information is secret, classified. We pushed for a bill that would require biofuel companies to actually open up their books and say how much we were paying for their fuel. And the former chair of the PUC, Carlito Caliboso, said, we don't need legislation, we'll just require it. And the new PUC chair came in, Mina Morita, and she carried on that policy. And then the utility said, we don't want to give it to you. And so the PUC backed off and said, don't bother giving it to us. So the cost information on different fuels is secret. And it's really hard as ratepayers to say we have geothermal, we have wind, we have solar, we have all these different resources. We don't know how much any of them costs us. How would you, it would be like going to the food store and you see all these cans of foods and none of them have prices on them.
You tell us the transmission is the same way.
The utility has said to us, We cannot break down the cost of generation versus transmission versus distribution. We can't do it, and we won't do it. So you can hear some state legislators say that X percentage of your bill is for transmission. What that means is somebody at the utility gave a comment to him without any backup, without any documentation, and say, oh, this is the number. An example of a number like that is, in 1989, the city of Honolulu wanted to know how much it would cost to bury all the electric lines on Oahu. So they passed a resolution, and they gave it to the Department of Public Works. The Department of Public Works gave it to the Underground Coordinating Committee, which is a group of people who are utilities that actually bury lines. And at the first meeting, HECO said, a 1 followed by 10 zeros, 10 billion. And then somebody said, do you actually including the substations and all that to put the entire thing on? And they said, oh, we'll add a third, 13.4 billion. So if that number isn't pulled out of a hat, I don't know what is. And that's where a number of the utility numbers come from. They just pull out numbers at random and think that people will begin quoting them. And if you quote them enough, they become gospel. For example, Oahu lacks renewable energy. And so you hear this, you hear it by Billy Kenoi, that we need geothermal to be brought to Oahu because Oahu doesn't have enough sun, solar, and waves.
But it's cheap, don't you know?
And it's a lie, but if you say a lie enough times, wasn't it Goebbels who said if you say a lie enough times, it becomes the truth? Sansu? I knew it was somebody.
I hate to end this, but actually we're supposed to leave here by 8 o'clock. I just looked for what, 7:51?
henry.lifeoftheland@gmail.com. I get emails from elementary school kids and lawyers, so, and scientists, so henry.lifeoftheland@gmail.com to carry on the conversation with.
When will you be out from under your non-disclosure agreement?
The way non-disclosure. Right. I've represented Lifeland in 30 regulatory proceedings before this.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was looking at my return. How are you?
At the end of each proceeding, I have to destroy all the confidential documents, and I'm never allowed to have them. One final question.
Just out of curiosity, the solar farm on Market Energy, is that one of the molten salt?
I don't know. I do know that the problem on Hawaii is that Spartan sand, one, is a huge percentage of the total load when they shoot it off the grid. And the electricity can only flow one way on the grid. But I do not know specifically the batteries and the solar they're installed.
Well, this is installed back.
Molten salt is very new, so I would say it's not.
All right.
I'm so glad to hear Life of the Land is still alive. I thought you were long gone.
We were founded by 15 women. Of course, when the men arrived, they needed organization, structure, and a name. And as far as I could tell, the last two names being considered were Life of the Land and the Mad Marching Mothers of Manila.
Oh, right absolutely.
Oh, yes.
Do you have designs for small hydroelectric?
Very strong.
No, but they will be there very soon.
Great talk. Thank you. Well, I just appreciate you coming down and everybody.
No. The military is but the military is not pushing it back. There was some talk by some people that what if the wind farms only power the military bases? And the military is like, we don't want it to stabilize the water. The military is actually, in terms of great quality, so water heaters and other things are more pro-renewable than utilities. So it should be pointed out, maybe on Oahu, one time, quarters of all the solar systems added across all energy facilities.
I gave Bob my phone. I know he's got arthritis. I don't actually. Can I do my phone number?
We're house sitting, we had to What did you study?
Yeah, you do. Well, if you tell me that James is there, no way you can break the no waste energy. And if it's all running, it's just not. I think we did it all the time.
But I think
That's why